Hi there, Megan Thompson here with Megan Thompson Coaching, and we are going to cover the barriers that you are dealing with when you're parenting a sensitive kid that can keep you stuck in inconsistency. You're having a hard time following through on the expectations for your child, or if you find yourselves arguing at home, wondering if you're being consistent enough for your sensitive kid, then today is the day. We're going to cover this today. So if you are wondering whether or not you're being too passive, or you're coddling your kid, or your punishments aren't strict enough, or whether or not your child needs strict parenting or strict punishments, and you find yourself just consistently getting into disagreements with your spouse on this topic, I want us to cover this today. All right. Now, when I say parenting the meltdown cycle, what do I mean by that? Sensitive children who are having daily meltdowns, who are throwing their body on the floor, they're yelling, they're stomping their feet, they're raising their voice, they're experiencing this on a daily basis. Your child might be hitting, kicking, screaming, and throwing things, anything, they can get their hands on, or just yelling, ineffectively on a daily basis. I want you to notice that daily emotional intensity is not developmentally appropriate for children beyond toddlerhood. So what does that mean? That means that if your child is 4 and they're having meltdowns on a daily basis, we want to see those meltdowns be a maximum of 10 minutes. And daily is really, really intense for a 4-year-old. So it is on the very high end. When I say 10, 15 minutes, I'm not saying that needs to be 15 minutes on the dot every day or else, right? I mean, you need to look at your child and wonder whether or not your child's behavior is effective and if they have skills to grow through. And I also want you to take a clear look at your child's needs. And if they are on the daily basis feeling frustrated, overwhelmed, stuck, irritable, and they're not demonstrating creative problem solving as a rule or in a whole, even if they're not having a meltdown every single day, then this is a problem for your sensitive child. So our work here at MTC, we help parents of highly sensitive children eliminate daily meltdowns in as little as 8 weeks. And today I told a mom that she was coddling, and we were coaching in our coach room, and I was talking about this, and I want to talk about this because one of the things that parents get really stuck on is wondering how gentle parenting and the science behind gentle parenting can work for sensitive children. And yet, if it's not working, you can wonder if gentle parenting is appropriate for your child. And there's a big difference between using science-backed parenting and coddling your kids. So I want to talk about this because the main thing of it is she wasn't actually coddling her child as much as we were talking about in that moment. We were talking about the fact that she was coddling her husband. And so let's cover it, okay? We're going to keep that family's needs and their information private, but I want to talk about the pattern that we see for so many families who get stuck in this emotional mentality of how to parent a sensitive kid, and where your frustration can actually leave your spouse or co-parent out to dry. All right, leave them hanging out to dry. And coddling, guys, you might have heard me say this before, but coddling is either in the do it my way or else, my way or the highway, right? That's coddling. Or it's in you're so fragile, poor you, let me do it all for you, okay? So it's really important that you guys see that that's two sides of the same coin, and it's probably not something that you've heard before. So I'm here to unpack that with you. We're going to cover this. We're going to cover the challenges that you're experiencing at this point and the barriers that you need to watch out for that are going to keep you stuck in the meltdown cycle. So meltdown cycle, like I said, is obviously daily or multiple times a week meltdowns. beyond the age of 4. If your child is sensitive, it doesn't necessarily matter whether or not they are sensitive because they have ADHD, they're sensitive because they have level 1 autism, or if they are sensitive because they have a highly sensitive temperament trait. There is some overlap. It is more important that you understand that parenting in those 3 neurotypes are important. And if your child is holding it all in and only exploding at home, it's much more likely that they have a highly sensitive temperament compared to a child who has a more pervasive functioning need in terms of their emotions. They're not able to function effectively in managing their emotions in multiple avenues of their life. However, we've seen highly sensitive kids who are struggling with both. They're melting down at school and at home. Okay. Doesn't necessarily mean the kiddo is autistic or has ADHD. Okay. So it is important to consult with a professional because we're talking about a minority need, right? And so when your child fits in that minority criteria, 1 of every 5, right? 20% of the population, it's a majority minority, but it's still a specialty we're talking about here. Okay. So definitely recommend that you consult with a professional, whether that's us or not, that's up to you, right? But what I know is that we know how to solve the problem. So let's talk about what the problem is and where you could be stuck. Now, as a parent, you might be wondering whether or not your child just needs hard and fast rules and expectations, and whether or not your child is able or capable of following through on your rules and expectations on a daily basis. If your child is hitting regularly, you might wonder whether or not your kid can handle being told that it's bedtime if they're crying or sad or overwhelmed, because you see they're in such distress, right? And if your child is struggling with distress and is also aggressive or easily frustrated, it can be difficult to wonder how or when do I want my child to safely communicate emotions so that I'm reinforcing that without reinforcing behavior like hitting or name calling or yelling or any other ineffective behavior, right? Because when we're parenting sensitive kids, we're not parenting robots. We're parenting children who are healthily communicating their own emotions. That means that they will speak passionately. And there's a big difference between speaking passionately and yelling, all right? That's a key piece. One thing that I see many parents get stuck on is really knowing how to assess effective behavior from children in general, especially if this is your oldest kid. But certainly if your child is highly sensitive, you need to understand what progress looks like for sensitive kids. And there's so much noise out there that it can get really tough to put your kid to figure out how to not put your kid in a box. Now we see gentle parenting advisors who are talking about non-sensitive children when they say your child is feeling their feelings, and it's okay to let them feel their feelings and sit on the chair with them and cuddle them and snuggle them and let them have their moment. If you're parenting a sensitive kid, your kid's moment can last for an hour, 2 hours, all day, up and down and up and down. You're on a freaking roller coaster, right? So it's really important that you're learning that phrase, right? Be with your child with their emotion. Good idea. In practicality, not for an hour. Not for an hour, because a child's emotional intensity is too intense if they can't rise and fall. And we're expecting a rise and fall. There's an emotional chemical reaction in the mind for a healthy child, adult, where the vast majority of their emotional control and response is a 90-second chemical reaction. That's a minute and a half. All right. So if we're talking 4-year-old daily losing it for 15 straight minutes, that's still at the cap high end of developmentally appropriate. So you get to decide, does my child have growth to do? Do I want that growth to happen now or later? Do I want to see how this plays out? Or do I want to take clear and consistent action now so I can stop wondering and I can feel much more empowered as a parent? Because parenting, while it doesn't require you to have a master's degree in order to parent sensitive kids, it does require you to feel confident that your approach is going to work. And because we're talking about sensitive children here. So sensitive kids without emotion management skills, they grow up to be people-pleasing workaholics at best, or they grow up with risky self-destructive behaviors or other destructive behaviors. So destructive behaviors towards others is what I mean by that. So that means that their hitting, kicking, screaming at 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 turns into assault, right? Turns into shutting down and wanting to die, right? And I'm not saying that to make you scared. You should be worried about that. Like, that is a huge thing. I parent a sensitive kid. I am concerned about her future, and I parent her accordingly. Now, when I say that, I mean that she is a thriving, emotionally regulated, communicative child who doesn't just know how to talk to adults. She also knows how to talk to kids and is playful and knows how to relax and sets herself up for standards and gives herself grace and communicates her needs and doesn't lose it regularly at an extreme level, right? So when we're talking about this, it is important to note that emotion management for children doesn't have to be a siloed experience, right? Like, we're not asking you to have a crystal ball with your kid, but we're definitely expecting as parents that we know enough about emotional intelligence and emotion regulation that if we're not having the skill set happen for our child within 2 to 3 months of progress of working on this, then there's a real problem, because we help our clients achieve that success and feel not just empowered that they know what they're doing, but also that they know what to assess and that they know how to communicate differently so that they're working on the same team rather than trying to convince each other that their team is right? In 2 months. And so when you've been at this for years, I want you to really ask yourself, how much longer do you want to keep throwing dice on the floor and seeing what shakes out? So, especially if your child is struggling, okay? So, because it's not just about you, right? It's not just about you and your comfort level, because you might say, well, Megan, I'm in this for the long haul. I am never going to give up on my kid. Well, sure, you're never going to give up on your kid, but do you want to be the adult who is trying to get your kid out of your basement, and you're saying, I'm never going to give up on you, when they say they can't get out of the basement, they can't take on a job? You're saying, it's okay, honey, I'm never going to give up on you. That's a choice that you're making now when your kid is 6, 5, 2, right? That they need to tolerate discomfort and they need to tolerate frustration and do the hard thing anyways. Perfectionism as a trait will not lend to effective communication in the future and effective problem solving and success in the future. I was actually talking to a parent about this the other day, where their child is perfectionistic. Okay. She wants it the way she wants it, when she wants it. And if that's not happening, then she's not doing it, right? So we have a challenge here, a big skill gap between her vision and reality, and whether or not that vision is happening in reality and whether or not she can tolerate that, right? And so the kid is not yet through puberty. So she's, 8, 9, 10. And the parents are wondering, how long do I have to help her tolerate reality before she starts to experience reality? And I don't have to teach her that reality isn't revolving around her, all the time, right? And the conversation we had was, you don't have to wait a long time. That actually is ineffective. It's not functioning. It's not a good thing that she's struggling with this behavior. You need to fix this now, right? Because children will wonder about their perception and why they can't see their perception in reality. And emotionally healthy children will communicate that to their parents, and then they will hear their parents on why they can't or won't. Or they will feel a feeling and they'll feel validated by their parents, and then they'll move on. Sensitive kids who don't have that skill harp and loop and freak out and lose it. That's a skill gap. That's not developmentally appropriate. And so when we're looking at the barrier that we're talking about here, first, you have to know what you're assessing. You have to understand whether or not your child is making progress based on what you're applying, because it's not just about your stamina, which brings me to number 2. You have to have stamina, of course, right? Like, you have to understand what your target is. You need a timeline on your target. And then if you're not reaching your target within the general timeline, then your question becomes, are we this close or are we this close, right? Like, are we are we an inch away from that? Or are we miles away from that? So your knowledge on what's developmentally appropriate and how far away are you between the developmentally appropriate gaps and non-developmentally appropriate gaps, like a quick Google search can help you learn what is developmentally appropriate behavior for a 5-year-old. And you will see on whatever, like parents.com or Psychology Today or something. I'm sure of it. I haven't looked it up on Google because I have a degree in this stuff. But like, I am sure you will find an article that tells you it is not developmentally appropriate for a 5-year-old to be hitting every single day, let alone multiple times a week. Okay. So if that's what's going on, you have a problem. You need to fix it. Okay. And I think that's important because we have so many parents who are like, I don't know. I mean, my neighbor's kid is smacking his brother. And my question is, yeah, but is that happening multiple times a day, every day? Would your neighbor tell you if you asked? Oh, okay, well then why are you looking at that data as like real data? It's a reference point. It's an anecdote. It's not real data. So you definitely need to inform yourself, okay? Definitely need to inform yourself. What am I assessing here? What's normal? What's typical? Sensitive children do not have to experience meltdowns on a daily basis. And in fact, I will tell you that is not normal. All right. That's not developmentally appropriate. Your child doesn't feel safe in their own body. And it is wrong for any professional to tell you that they are communicating because in that high explosive manner because they feel safe. They do not feel safe. That is wrong information. That is information that it was taught to clinicians to characterize traumatized children and the fact that they trusted an adult enough to share what's going on, but because they were traumatized, they didn't have the skill set to share it safely, so they just emotionally verbally vomited all their needs, which is aggressive and frustrating and overwhelming. Now, if your child is being abused, then they will be reclusive and antisocial. They will respond in a way that is not towards relationships. Okay. That's true. So for an abused child who's experienced intense trauma, right? If they are sharing their emotions and screaming and yelling, that is a good thing in the sense that the opposite is that they curl up and die, right? Like, we don't want that. But that assessment of safety is trauma-informed assessment. If your child's not experiencing a trauma, you do not use that language to characterize that your kid feels safe. If they're losing their mind and they haven't experienced a trauma in their life, they are not safe at home in their bodies. And this is where gentle parenting gets it very wrong. And it's not your fault if you're stuck here because you're being mistaught. It's really, really wrong that clinicians are not explaining this and that mommy bloggers aren't explaining this to you, because when you hear a nice sound bite, you can run with it if you don't understand what you're talking about, man. And it is damaging to parents today because, and we see this, you can read all kinds of books. You can read, The Coddling of the American Mind. You can read Bad Therapy. Like there are different parts of, there's so many books to read, right? But books don't talk back. So there's concepts that are important for you to understand, that when this general attachment-focused parenting was focused on teaching parents who are either coming out of an abusive relationship, domestic violence, or they are, there's generational trauma going on. We have to teach the basics of emotion management, all right? And we have to teach the basics of the concept that behavior is emotion. I believe you are beyond that education, not from an intellectual standpoint, like there's always more to learn, but because your family hasn't experienced trauma, your child's behavior is beyond that standard, that this is okay, that out is better than in, because out isn't always better than in if your sensitive kid is not being hurt, okay? If your sensitive kid is not being hurt, then out isn't better than in. Both are not great, right? So I want to talk about this. That is so important. Both are not great. We have to address both. You have to understand what you're assessing and whether or not you're making any progress. Like I said, if you don't have a clear and consistent action that you know you can take over and over and over again and repeat lengthy, longer success over and over again, then you need a different process. All right. I'm not talking about tactics. Okay. So when it comes down to assessing your progress, you have to also know that we're not talking tactical. Okay. So think about this. Tools in the toolbox, those are tactics. Validation is a tactic. Sitting with your kid and not saying anything, that's a tactic. Okay. That's not a strategy. A strategy is a process that you learn, that you follow one thing and then you learn a new skill and that stacks on it, and then you learn a new skill and that stacks on it, and then you've created foundational change in your relationship because your skills are not magic wands. They are part of a collection of approaches that work. So think about it like you're learning a foreign language. You're going to need to learn to talk about the concept of food, right? So the tactic of using language like limon means lemon and lime in Spanish, right? That's a tactic. You need to understand that tactical application of the word, right? But speaking and ordering water with lemon and knowing the culture and how to do that effectively and how to order from a whole menu, which includes reading the menu and then also deciding what you want to eat, right? In a foreign country, that's a skill set. Okay, so a tactic is having scissors and AirPods and being able to go to work because you got two things you need at your desk. You have tools in your toolbox. However, if you don't know how to use those tools and you don't know what tool is used for what, you won't, or what tool needs to be used first in order for the second one to work, then you will treat your jackhammer like a hammer and you'll get stuck because you'll create a lot more destruction thinking that your child doesn't respond to validation and that validation doesn't work with your kid. Well, validation doesn't work with your kid if that's your only skill. You're right. It's not going to work. It's not sufficient. We're putting Band-Aid on something that needs surgery. And so I'm going to stop mixing metaphors here. It is important for you to note that, yes, validation, you got to validate your kid. Help them feel that their feelings are normal. Don't do that by saying, I've been in your shoes before. Let me tell you about a story about me. That's not validation. Other people might tell you it is. It's not. Okay, so that's number one. Assess your progress. Assess your tools. Determine, do you have enough tools in the toolbox, right? A good coach is going to tell you that there are many tools that fit together, and they will tell you they have a set of tools that works and is effective, all right? This is important when we're talking about an understanding of needs, and then also communicating what works with sensitive children is having an understanding of their mind as well as an understanding of how you influence them with your mind and your perception and your assumptions. So this is the next thing, is that if you don't have the emotional stamina to manage your emotions, you will lose steam swiftly and you will stop being consistent. So this is number two. You have to have mental stamina, mental fortitude within reason. So if your mental fortitude is, you know what, I've told my kid 5 times that they are expected to follow directions and the fifth time I'm going to yell because that's as long as my stamina is, then you don't have enough stamina for your sensitive kid, because you shouldn't have given them 5 directions in the first place. Your tool is wrong. Okay? Because your tool of waiting 5 times before they finally follow directions is not an effective tool. Now, I'm not a figurehead of first-time obedience, but your tool needs to be noticing, why is my child not following directions the first time? Is it a relationship issue? Is it a needs issue? Are they communicating something and I'm not picking it up? Or are they genuinely not cognizant to the need and the urgency of the request? Okay. So you have to assess the problem in that moment and then determine what tool do you use. And the tool can't be force or coddling. Okay. So we're going into coddling, because if reminding your spouse or co-parent over and over and over again about what they're supposed to do, and they're not taking ownership and personal power on changing their directions, that means you're probably overperforming for them, which means you're coddling for them. So coddling, like I said earlier, is in going into force, because I don't believe you're capable unless I yell at you, right? Whether you do it after, 6 reminders or 5 or 2, either way, you're telling your child they're not capable until you yell at them. And so if you're coddling your spouse, what that looks like is you're telling them that they're wrong, but you're not clear on how to actually get them to learn what you know, and you're not able to coach your spouse. Now, in our work, we don't teach our clients to coach each other at all. We help even out that imbalance of power, because it took 2 to tango, make the baby, right? Or decide to bring the baby into the household, okay? And if that's the case, then it takes 2 to parent. So one parent is not going to parent the other parent. If that happens, then that parent that's being parented is being coddled. And it's also very likely, more often than not, that this is not a beta male we're talking about. This is not necessarily a very passive parent. Typically, that parent is also struggling. You might be struggling if you're listening to this. If your honey gave you this recording, you might be struggling with knowing what to know and what to assess, which makes you feel disempowered. And you're telling yourself that you can defer. All right. And that, my friend, is going to keep you stuck. All right. So I want you to decide that you can lead your child and that you can work alongside your spouse. And that if you guys can't agree on something, then you need a coach who can help you address the relationship in your marriage and your skill set and your knowledge. Okay. So when we help our clients, not all of our clients are on totally different pages. Usually they have the same vision. Typically, they have a hard time figuring out the process to get there. So that's where they disagree. And then we have other parents who are like, no, we know the vision. We both know we don't know the process. We try not to argue about it. So we help parents in both categories, but we don't typically work. Our clientele is not the egotistical parent who thinks they know everything and wants to argue, and is so far stuck up their own interests in my way or the highway that they're not willing to hear anybody. Like, that's just not coachable, and that's not our clientele. So unfortunately, you will need to go to therapy for your family if that's the dynamic that you have. We are not a fit, our team. We don't work with complainers, and we don't work with people who want to make it harder than it needs to be. And you have to be humble in order to receive help. So that is definitely necessary. However, if you are a spouse and you see when your spouse is frustrated that they kind of turn into this like bullheaded, stubborn mentality, it doesn't mean that they can't change, right? So if they can have a clear and consistent conversation with you when they're not upset, then great. We could be a very good fit. All right. Don't look at your spouse's worst case scenario self as who they are. And we teach our clients to do the same thing about their kids, right? You can't look at your kids' worst case scenario self as who they are. And in fact, that's where Dr. Aaron gets really stuck. It's where the strong-willed child mentality gets really stuck, because we're looking at the child as the worst case scenario and we're saying, oh, let's make it a little bit better. But meltdowns are still going to happen. That perception of your child is actually wrong, right? Which is probably why your spouse is very frustrated, because they see the power, they see the strength of your kid, and If it's not happening fast enough, they might blame, which isn't great, right? That's definitely not great, effective skill set. However, if they're willing to have that conversation with you, then they should very well likely be willing to have that conversation with us. And we're happy to have that conversation with you guys about the fact that neither of you is doing what works, quite frankly. And I'm sure that part of that can be validating to both of you, and you both need to be validated in order to be empowered to change. So your ability to not coddle your spouse in their anger and frustration and treat them like fragile is also necessary. So this is what we were talking about with one of our clients. She knew, she raised her hand and she was like, let me have it, Megan. I know I'm stuck too. So she was fantastic. It was so fun to coach her because she's not the type to complain. She's not the type to, to just wait for other people to solve her problems. And yet she was falling into that helplessness with her relationship with her husband, because helplessness for her looked like fixing everything and being a victim about it, right? Which obviously is not going to be very pretty for the marriage at all, right? And it didn't make him feel good either. Like, they both realized that they didn't like that. So we had that conversation on the breakthrough call, because their child was struggling, but so were they. But they don't see themselves as struggling people, like people who struggle, people whose lives are tough. And so there was a big identity gap, right? Of wait a minute, I'm a problem solver. I don't tend to complain. I know I can figure this out. I just don't have the right process. And yet I don't really like the way that I'm showing up in my marriage or with my kids. And my kids struggling. So, all right, we definitely need this help. And that's where the conversation becomes really fun, because then we get to figure out where are the gaps. We get to go gap hunting, right? Where I find that parents need therapy is if you have a really hard time looking at your own gaps and you try to dismiss your gaps because it's too uncomfortable to look at it. Therapy is more appropriate in that respect, because you have a hard time being vulnerable in order to grow. And that just means that your capacity to tolerate growth is going to take a longer time, right? You have to build your capacity to tolerate growth in order to grow. And so therapy takes, for sensitive kids to break out of this pattern, it takes about a year and a half. Usually in that process, parents are invited to the process, because the child, if the parents decide to go that route to address fixing their kid, then the therapist is going to notice eventually that the parents need to be involved. Doesn't always happen at the beginning, unfortunately. So it's usually like 6 months to a year into that process where they're like, wait a minute, I've been working really hard on this kid and he's not changing. And now you're frustrated with me. So let's have some more sessions with you. They have like this reactive process that happens in therapy. The therapist does. And then eventually they start bringing the kid into therapy with their parents, or the parents in first and then the kid in separate. So that just takes a lot longer. And it's definitely necessary for parents who struggle with vulnerability to the point where they can't even talk about it. And they get defensive because, number one, my process works too quickly. Look, in terms of the intensity work that we have, our work is too fast for families who struggle with being vulnerable. They don't actually get in it. It just takes a lot longer to get out what they're hoping, and they kind of fight the process the whole way. So we get everybody the breakthrough because we have that 98% success rate, but it's really hard. And at this point, it's easier for us to peg that on the initial call. So we don't often invite families in who have that challenge anymore. So we refer to therapy. So anyways, like I'm saying, therapy takes a while because you got to figure out whether or not you can handle being vulnerable. And then you got to figure out whether or not you can handle doing anything about it. And that process is like a self-exploration process. And so it's the client leads the show, and the therapist follows the process, and the therapist helps the client realize what skills they need to build in order to feel even more comfortable with that. So there's a lot of looking at yourself with a looking glass and saying, okay, what about this? What about this? What about this? I want to try this first. I want to try that first. So the client is in control in a therapeutic process. It's the whole framework of whatever the client wants to bring to the conversation is what the client learns about in most therapeutic processes. Now, if you're working with a therapist for like a targeted specific behavior issue and they're following an evidence-based protocol, then they will likely run the conversation. They'll set the agenda. They'll tell you what you need to learn. They'll tell you what you need to do. And then they'll build a skill in that session. That's still going to take about a year for you because their meetings are weekly and it's only an hour and it's still related to your questions only. So you can't really leverage time, but you could probably shrink it a little bit. When we worked with our clients, we had the kid in therapy, we had the kid in group therapy, we had the parent in work and the parent in individual group workshop to teach the topic, and then steps to do outside of the session as well as in their own session to work on their own stuff. It's like 4 times a week. That's the intensive that we did. We saw the faster results that way, right? It wasn't 4 times a week for the entire 6 months to a year. But it was at one point, we were asking them to come 4 times for 4 different sessions, right? Maybe sometimes the parent was working while the kid was working. So, we're leveraging time that way, but the expense is the same. Okay. So, the expense in time, the expense in obviously financial. So when we're talking about stamina and losing momentum and losing motivation, that's a you thing. How committed am I to turn this around swiftly so that I can stop swirling the drain in what ifs? And that takes grit. It also takes a perception that you are capable of change faster than you think you are if you have the right process. So you're willing to look at yourself outside of yourself, right? If I believed I could change, then I would. If I had a process that I knew would work, then I would. Those are the conversations you have with yourself. If you're like, I don't know if I could change. I don't know. I'm kind of stubborn. I kind of get really stuck. I kind of suck at change. Yeah, I think I suck. Like if that's the conversation you usually have and the conclusion you usually come to is like, nah, I don't really want to look at that. Then therapy is definitely a better fit because you got to shift that perception of yourself. If you worry, then coaching can work. But if you believe that you suck, then therapy is a better fit. And if you're defensive about somebody saying, hey, you suck at this, to the point where you get mad at that person, then therapy is a better fit because I'm not here to be judgmental, right? But what you're doing ain't working. So if you interpret me saying what you're doing ain't working as you suck, and then you get mad at me, then you need to do some work. We got to go therapy. Okay. So, but if you can say, you know what, Meg, you're right. I don't know what I don't know. And so I'm not great at this, right? I'm trying, right? But I'm not great at this. Can you help me out? Right? Like that's where we get to have that conversation, right? There's a level of self-awareness where if I say something bluntly, you know that you can tolerate that and not be triggered as if I'm verbally abusing you, right? And this is that whole concept that like children are not fragile. When you're firm with them and the words don't come out perfectly, they can handle it. And if they can't, then it's probably because you're treating them like they're fragile. You don't have the skill set to stop treating them like they're fragile. And now they've internalized the belief that they're fragile. And so they respond accordingly. And so children actually experience fragility as their kryptonite. And so when we treat them like they're fragile, they start to disintegrate. Like mentally, their identity disintegrates. They stop believing who they are. They stop thinking who they are and all of that. And they stop believing that they can. And all the reassurance and convincing in the world isn't going to change that. You have to shift your approach. So like I said, barrier number 1, you need to know what you're assessing. You need to know that the problem often in front of your face isn't the real problem. Number 2, you have to have stamina. You have to have internal sense of control that if you had a process, you could change your kid. You have to know that. Or you have to be willing to learn how to know that. So I'm not saying you need to know how, but you need to know that you can if you had a process. You need to know that, right? You have to have self-esteem that's high enough to get to that, okay? Number 3, you need to understand that your communication style and your learning style could be very different than your spouse or co-parent, but that does not make it wrong unless you guys have different values. And when I say wrong, I mean the approach is just never going to get you to where you need to be, and our approach won't work either. If you have a value of first-time obedience and your spouse has a value of communication and collaboration and follow through without negotiation, like a hostage situation in your house, then you guys have very different values, and those values will be inhibiting you from getting your process met, right? Because your values will dictate your process. If you value efficiency, you will try to solve this problem efficiently. If you value your time, you will try to not waste time in this process. If you value safe and healthy communication, you will find a parenting process that highlights and keeps safe and healthy communication in the whole household. So everyone feels safe, not just you or your spouse, but your children, because no one feels safe if they're using unsafe language. Children don't use unsafe language if they feel safe. They use safe language if they feel safe, because children don't communicate in a meta communication way. That's an adult process. So children use safe communication when they feel safe in their bodies, and they do that consistently if they have a process to find safety in their bodies themselves, not just through being told what to do, right? And that's important. So that's the other thing, right? You guys need to have, if you're in a 2-parent household, you need to have the same values, and you will be much more successful at breaking out of this pattern consistently if you're not constantly arguing about values. That will keep you stuck. It will be very difficult to see the forest for the trees and follow your own skill sets and keep it going if you have a clear, consistent value idea of shared values in terms of the goals. Okay, so here's the thing. There's a lot of parents who never necessarily had that conversation before you got married or before you had kids of, what are the lessons we want to teach our kids? What are the things we want them to learn as they grow up? You kind of just decided to have kids because you expect yourself to figure it out along the way. You see yourself as capable and powerful. And so you tried not to make a big deal out of nothing. That might have been one reason why you didn't have a conversation about values. The other one is because you maybe didn't have any mentors in your life, personally. Maybe your parents didn't show you how to do that, or you don't have a reference point. You just know that you want to avoid how you were raised. So there's a value in that, but the value is not clear because you're discussing it like an absence of something. So when you discussed, I want to raise our kids without spanking because I was spanked and I didn't like that. Great, we're on the same page. Okay, good. Yeah, me too. A goal is not an absence of something. Whenever you're trying to achieve something, you're not looking to avoid the opposite of it. You're trying to achieve something. So, we take the concept of SMART goals, right? Where we're talking about your family's dreams. I want dinner time without yelling is not a goal. I want peaceful, communicative, calm, collaborative, pass the salt. How was your day? And we have a deeper conversation than just fine, right? And instead it's, well, here's what I did today, and here's what I loved about today, and here's what I need help with, Mom. And, Sally did this and I was nervous about her, but I know that she can ask for help, right? And so there's conversation and there's communication and there's depth to the conversation. So it's not just surface. It was good. Thanks. How much homework do you have? Great. Right? Like I want a household without yelling. That's a pretty low standard, right? I'm not blaming you, because if you grow up in a yelling house, it's higher than where you came from, right? but it's still an absence of something. It doesn't tell you clearly what you really want at home. So my question is, at this point, if you guys are struggling with the values conversation, sit down and have a conversation with each other. Okay, we've been trying to avoid worst case scenario. That's a good thing. We don't want worst case scenario in any house, okay? But what do we really, really, really want in our house? And I'll just be fine is not part of the conversation. If you start the sentence with, well, I'd just be happy if we didn't argue, then your bar is too low still, okay? So your goal in parenting needs to be that you're working together collaboratively, and that conversation ends in a resolution in the same conversation more often than not in the span of like the length of dinner time, right? For example, because unless you're having like heated, lifelong decision-making conversations, like, are we going to move across country and become hermits? That's going to take a couple convos, right? Then what should we have for dinner tomorrow? Or can I go to my sister's house this weekend with the kids, or without the kids, right? Like, what do you have? Not like you're asking your spouse permission, but like, do you have opportunity to watch the kids because I want to go or whatever? That conversation with an adult who's, you guys have shared values, you should be able to come to a conclusion in the same conversation. So why are we expecting our children to not have that skill set either? And that kind of communication level is happening regularly in your household. If that's not happening regularly, then the household's standard is not a healthy standard. Okay. So I've been talking about this for quite a while today. And that brings us to the end of today's show. If your family is having a hard time struggling, this is one of the things that we do in our breakthrough calls is we cover the fact, or rather whether or not your standards are too low, quite frankly, for your family, and whether or not you want to actually learn how to aim higher. And a good coach is going to tell you what you can achieve and then also stretch you to achieve more than what you expected to achieve. An advice giver is going to tell you how to reach the outcome you decide on. So a good coach or a consultant is going to say, sure, you can reach this goal, but you can also reach this one within this virtually the same amount of time. Do you want to talk about that? Right? Because there needs to be choice in the matter. Or, you know what? I think you're actually aiming too low. And if you're feeling skeptical about that opportunity, then that's your work to do. Not the coach's. Because if the coach can reach that objective with their clients, then your question needs to become, well, how fast do I want that? So if you're ready to have that conversation, how fast do I want my outcome? Definitely book a call with my team. MeganThompsonCoaching.com/talk is how you get on our calendar. We'll figure out if we can help you and if our process is going to be a good fit to stop the meltdown cycle as soon as possible so that your family can focus on thriving, and to do this in a way where you build skills to assess the problem differently and have a totally different way of looking at the problem so that your family can be focusing on choosing their own way of thriving that is collaborative with everybody in the household. And that is true whether you're a family of 2 or 7 or 9, right? And we're happy to have that conversation with you. So again, you can apply MeganThompsonCoaching.com/talk. And we're going to talk about where you're stuck, obviously, and then we'll talk about what your goals are. And if our process can help you reach your goals, then we will tell you how that works. And you can get started as early as on the same call. Because why wait to live your best life? All right. Now, look forward to talking to you soon and have a great day.